Hey everybody, welcome back for another episode of Riftbound 101. Today, from snowy Montreal and freezing Montreal, we're doing Yasuo in Focus. So this is episode 11. We've been doing a pretty heterogeneous mix recently of talking about Spirit Forge cards and also like the meta and things that are shaping up. And Yasuo's kind of been circling around the discussion because of one of the top 64 decks at the Houston regional qualifier, which I think is actually a really cool build. And I've been getting a lot of requests for Yasuo since I talked about him in my budget episode a couple weeks back. So the plan for today is, as usual with these in focus episodes, to talk about core concepts and key pieces, which I think is like really the sort of stock version of this episode, and then to talk about refinement, budget versions, and experimentation in Yasuo. I think in general, Yasuo remains one of the most budget friendly heroes or legends, but there are versions of this which offer even more budget approaches or a little bit more investment depending on what you're interested in. And I think there's still a lot of room for improvement in how Yasuo is played, which we can glean from recent tournament results. And I have some inklings about that. Okay. So the core concept of Yasuo inside of green and purple is to move friendly units from your base to a battlefield or from your battlefield to a base, not between battlefields, for the cost of 2 and exhausting him. This means that Yasuo provides pseudo accelerate for 2 energy instead of 1 energy and rune, which is often what the accelerate costs are for units. And it means that you can produce some interesting sub combinations of units by turning 2 drops into 4 drops that effectively have the move to an open battlefield clause, but also produce certain accelerated attacks. I think he's really neat. I think in general, he just hasn't been slotting well into the metagame, but he has access to a lot of cards that are really solid and that we're seeing produce some really good results. In particular, commons in purple have been showing a lot of equity for Annie over the Kaisa lists. So that's a really cool aspect of this. As usual, I think talking about the metagame, the main deck curve of the metagame dominant version is always useful. So this is the main deck curve A. This is for GhaelWinds top 64 deck, and that list will pop up at the end of this video. As you can see, very strong concentration of 2-cost units, spells, and gear, with barely units outside of that. At 3, you have Wielder of Water. At 6, you have 1 Yasuo. At 7, you have 3 Mind Splitters. And at 10, you have 2 Raza. And then the rest are 10 spells at 1 mana, 1 rune, 1 energy cost to interact very heavily. So this is a hyper compressed, low to the ground interactive deck. But I wouldn't qualify it as exclusively an aggressive deck. So this isn't something like the hyper aggro Darius list or Victor list that just produce units early. They actually will often play their units in conjunction with open energy spells around 4 or 5. And in that way, it's kind of like a tempo deck in the way that Annie is a tempo deck. There are other versions of it. So surprisingly enough, this curve, which is for main deck B, and this is sort of the casino version that includes Nocturne, is often viewed more as the aggressive deck because your 4-cost unit you might be playing off of a reveal from Mystic Poro or Candlelight Sanctum or stacked deck, and then you're playing some amount of Yasuo, Kayn, Mind Splitter. This version actually plays 1 White Flame as like a battering ram, and then your Razas, which are they're listed at 10, but you could reasonably think of them as 6 might 4-cost cards. So this deck is a lot more proactive, and it runs significantly less spells at 10 and 2. So a little bit less a little bit less at 1 energy. So instead of 10, it runs 9, and then a bit more at 2, a bit less at 2, and it runs a bit more gear, which I'm personally not a fan of, but I think having this deck in here for illustration helps a lot. And then I'm going to be talking about main deck Curve C, which is a different deck that I've been experimenting with for Skirmish and is really experimental, but I figure it's always nice to give you some more options. And I'll talk you through my thinking when we get to that deck. But this version is even more intensively positioned on 1 cost and 2 cost spells and cheap units without any roses. So I'll show you what that looks like when we get to that part of the video. So the concepts that are really at the core of Yasuo are keeping runes open to play reactive spells or to accelerate. And knowing when to accelerate units and when to keep runes open is at the heart of this deck. It provides you with a pretty complicated decision to make in terms of when you want to tap out of resources. And my general sense is you would want to tap out of resources only when you are heavily punishing opponents, and you would rather play very conservatively with your runes otherwise. To that extent, you have 14 turn 1 drops in the GhaelWinds deck. Those include units, but also some gear. You have 13 pieces of card draw, which is often stapled on top of interaction like Discipline, but also on top of units. And then you have 21 pieces of interaction total, which includes things like Defy also, or units that will do something to your opponent units. So like Yasuo Remorseful Cast in this. But in general, it means that this deck is cheap, it likes to draw, and it likes to interact with your opponent. It's a deck that has answers. And I think one of the comments that I've heard through other folks that GhaelWinds made about his list is that Yasuo is a bad deck that has answers to good decks. This means, in general, that playing Yasuo is going to be a lot more complicated than playing a legend that is very straightforward and proactive and forces decision making on your opponent. It means you're going to have to find answers, and you're going to have to learn your matchups really well. So Yasuo is a legend that I think really rewards a specialist's approach. And at least in the current environment, I don't see making that much of a splash. Although I do think that Yasuo is reasonably well positioned in the next set, as there will be more access to deflect units and also more access to cheap interaction or new counterspells like the purple counterspell. So that's really it. And I've been talking about using his legend ability really in terms of pushing units into battlefields, but you can also take back units and then attack with them. So he can also effectively provide pseudo ganking for 2 energy. All of this is only during your turn, though. So be careful with how you utilize his ability and what you're doing. Yeah. So key pieces, pretty evident at this point. Small bodies, small spells, and a couple of keystone units that you want to protect or keep insulated through those spells. Some of them are small bodies, some of them are not, but that's really the core of this. So your small boys are going to be Traveling Merchant, Stalwart Portal, Clockwork Keeper, and Wheeler of Water. And I'm going to talk about them in an inverse order because I think they're easy to understand. Wheeler of Water is often a card that you will play when you're at 5 energy. It gets hyper punished by most removal that's running through Kaisa, but also in Annie with things like Voidseeker. So you want to be careful with how you utilize this unit, but it is effectively, if well protected, a 4 might 3 drop, which I like playing in most matchups. I think it's worst when you're playing it on curve, and Yasuo is a deck that often does not want to play on curve, or if it does, it's happy losing a unit for that benefit. To that extent, Clockwork Keeper, 2 might for 2 energy, and you can recycle a Calm Rune to get a draw. This I'm like less bothered by if I have like multiple 2 drops, or I have another body that I want to play next turn, and especially if I'm going second, I'm going to value the card draw a little bit more because I can often draw or have in hand a Defy or an On Guard to protect it. Stalwart Poro, same logic as Wheeler of Water. You would like to defend. You would be much more happy if this was like a, assault, I think, than a shield, but it is what it is in green. And as of next set, I think I prefer Lonely Poro, which draws you a card if there are no other units or no other Poros. I can't remember, but you'll value the card advantage quite highly. And then finally, Traveling Merchant. And Traveling Merchant is kind of stock in a lot of purple lists currently. Not all of them, but most. And Yasuo especially loves him. When you move, discard one, draw one. Crucially, you don't need to have a card in hand to draw. So you would, if you move him and you have no cards, you discard 0 and then draw 1. And when you play Traveling Merchant and you're playing Zon Warrens, which also has the same clause, and you're playing Raza, this effectively like allows you to play Raza very cheaply, very fast, or it's just a card draw engine. And the other card that we've been seeing a lot in Annie lists that synergizes very well with Traveling Merchant is Scrap Heap. So you're happy to discard a Scrap Heap to draw one more. So keep that in mind. Also, if you are running Scrap Heap, I think the general understanding is that you're going to start off with Zon Warrens and Scrap Heap, and when you are on match 2 and you're not on Zon Warrens anymore, you're going to side out the Scrap Heap for something else, which I think is quite fine. So you want to play these early to get points, which right now seems to be the way that the game is mostly played, unless you're playing Master Yi or an extremely late game controlling deck. You want to get on battlefields fast, and you want to protect them. If you are first and you're playing against Order, I think it's really tricky to play an open unit into a Call of the Week because you're not running that many units. Otherwise, your mileage may vary. So if you're against like Annie, I think you're reasonably okay playing a unit early, especially if it's Clockwork Keeper. But be careful and know what kind of removal opponents run. If you're against something like Set, you're super happy playing one of these early, and then it gets a bit trickier depending on what else is rummaging around. Interaction, really what you're looking for with your interaction, if it's stuff like Discipline and On Guard, which is really your combat interaction, you always want your units to just be like 1 might higher than the opponent and to draw off of it. So On Guard is great because it's lean, but Discipline will often be more useful to you, and cycling through might be something that you prefer. You want to effectively sort of milk as much removal in response to your spells as possible. You want to make opponents tap out. And this, like all green decks, you can really utilize Dreaming Tree quite heavily. So often you're going to get, 2 draw out of your interaction when you're on that battlefield. Dreaming Tree is also a battlefield that's heavily played in Annie and in Kaisa. So you're going to see a lot of it, and you're going to get a lot of value out of it. And I think Dreaming Tree really is one of the better battlefields currently. I think Yasuo either ends up usually being on parity or maybe 1 behind the Annie deck in terms of how many times it can trigger it. So you're reasonably happy playing into it as well. And then you have stuff like Defy, which you really want to save for removal that is bigger than like 1 or 2. So you don't want to defy like Stupefies. You want to defy Void Seekers, and you want to defy maybe Cleaves, which it's a lot harder for you to 1-for-1 with a Cleave when you're on defense. But you're really utilizing it for spells that will provide multiple axes of value. You're happy defying a Discipline that's on the opposing side as well. And not in this picture, but I think reasonable for this as well, is Fight or Flight. So if your opponent's using removal that targets a battlefield, so I think Hextech requires battlefield, then you're happy like Fight or Flighting your unit back to base. Or you can use it if people are like leaving a Darius into you or something. You can Fight or Flight the Darius back, you can Fight or Flight your own unit, and then draw off of it if it's like a merchant. There's a lot of utility for it. I generally like Fight or Flight more in hand, but Yasuo, because he doesn't have the open runes always available like Annie, might sometimes play it as a hidden card. Be aware that if you do that, you can only target the battlefield that it's hidden at. And also, if people spell through and it's something like a Void Seeker, you might have to use it on your own unit or not have like a value out of it. So again, the name of the game with Yasuo, and I think with all purple green decks going forward, is going to be like learn your interactions very well and understand when you are getting more value out of what you're committing. Yeah, we talked about the discard package. This is one of the more proactive parts of the deck and is a reasonable game plan. If you're going on first and you're not against a deck that runs a ton of removal, Traveling Merchant, you can move it into a battlefield, discard, draw. If you discard Scrap Heap, you're going to draw 2. Then you can move it back with Yasuo's ability and get another discard out of it. You can like really fill up your deck, your graveyard with cards and find your Razas and have them be super cheap early. So that's really one of the key versions of this. And then you commit less heavily to the Raza as games go on because you're not on Zon Warrens. I think exceptionally, if you're against a Darius, you might not side them out because Darius also tends to run Zon fairly heavily, depending on the version. So, you know, you're reasonably happy with that. And then you have like your units that you would want to protect that are a bit bigger outside of something like Wheeler of Water, which you're happy protecting your small units as well for incremental value. Mind Splitter is run in almost every list at this point. It's a fantastic 7-drop. It offers you it takes out their best card in hand. Often this is going to be things like Time Warps or Darius. But even if you're taking out like a Void Seeker, you're super happy to just get the hand information and make their life a bit harder. If you're against decks that don't draw heavily, Mind Splitter is pretty brutal. So this can make Darius decks or non-hook Darius decks or Victor decks kind of run out of gas in terms of card draw. And especially if you are against, I would say like generally more aggressive decks that don't run card draw, Mind Splitter is going to perform heavily very well. And it's often a turn 4 play that you can also protect behind a Defy or with an On Guard. The real killer is if you play Mind Splitter when you're on 9 runes, and then you can move him into a battlefield. You effectively have like a 7-cost accelerate unit, a 9-cost accelerate unit with 7 might, but you get to see the opponent's hand before you make the choice of whether or not you want to accelerate it, which is really good and has a lot of synergy. Nocturne. So Nocturne is really like the core of the casino version, where you're running Stack Decks and Mystic Poros and Candlelit Sanctum. Finding a Nocturne on turn 1 and then protecting it is pretty crazy. I think the most one-sided game I've played at an Nexus night was actually using Stack Deck as a starting player and finding 2 Nocturnes and just like winning the round straight up and sitting on open runes for the rest of the game, which tells you how strong sitting on open runes is in general. Green Yasuo, you're going to find in every shell. Purple Yasuo isn't really played in Champion Zone, and if he is played, he's played as a 1-of. So you get to always threaten using Yasuo Remorseful, and if opponents are put into a position where they have to tap out, and you can, feel comfortable playing Green Yasuo, accelerating him into a battlefield, maybe even using Ride the Wind. If you're playing Windswept Hillock, you can really punish them for it. But also, if you play Green Yasuo without protection or without accelerate, he might often get pinged off the board. 6 is kind of the not great scenario for him, where I would have, if he was 7 might, he would be infinitely stronger because he would be protected from just dying to a simple Falling Star, which admittedly Annie runs no Falling Stars in Champion, in like winning lists. So this is really a Kaisa problem. But yeah, and then not in either of the GhaelWinds or the Nocturne list that I'm going to show you, you're not going to see Sona. Sona was present in some other versions that were popping up around about a month ago. I really like Sona, and the version that I'm going to show you for me uses Sona, and Sona offers a stronger but more situational and difficult to activate version of Annie's untap 2 runes at the end of the turn. Sona allows you to untap 4. Or ready for exhausted runes. And in general, this, if you can play Sona on 6, so on turn 3, with the Yasuo Accelerate, she will untap 4 of the 5 runes that you have left over, and you can sit reasonably safe behind a lot of interaction. Which is really scary. And if for whatever reason you're going second against an Aurora deck that plays the everyone starts with 1 extra rune battlefield, you can actually play this on 2, and then things get really scary because you can just start getting points very safely, very quickly. So I like Sona a lot. I'm actually surprised she's not seeing a lot of play right now, but anyways, we'll talk about it in a little bit. For fields, we talked about Zone Warrens. It tends to be run in most lists that are running Raza. I like it even without. You want to draw as much as possible, and you're happy discarding Chaff. If you're playing Scrap Heap, you're happy playing it for sure. Then Dreaming Tree is kind of run like everywhere, really, that can run it. And one of the comments I think that Colin Kaiser made when he was reviewing his own set deck was that Dreaming Tree is the strongest battlefield in the game, and decks that can utilize Dreaming Tree are currently the best decks in the game. And I would tend to agree. Being able for a match to get 2 or 3 or 4 cards out of your battlefield, sometimes more, is amazing. And especially if you're playing against decks that cannot access it at all, like Hooked Darius, unless you're playing against a version of Hooked Darius that is on Cleaves, you're reasonably happy like finding ways to optimize your Dreaming Tree usage. In the mirror match, it can be very scary, depending on what the rune economy is like. Yasuo can kind of get clipped a little bit on that, and you might end up in a double Dreaming Tree match against a Kaisa player, which is a bit weird. And then Windswept is the third battlefield that I like a lot as a tech battlefield for Game 3. Here, what you can do is you can play Yasuo on like 10, and you're going to burn a ton of runes to do this, but you can play him, move him to a battlefield, Windswept, and if there are units there, he will kill them, you'll score, and you can ride the wind into the next battlefield, and so on. And if you're sitting on even more runes, or if you're not doing this with the move, you can just like untap, have a ton of open runes, send him in, play your disciplines, play your on guards, and then you can so you send him in with your Yasuo ability, and then you can just move him because Windswept grants ganking. So this is kind of like a poor man's Vi Ride the Wind combo, but it allows you to do it with a wider range of units, and that can be pretty scary if you are utilizing it adequately. It also doesn't punish you for playing this against Annie, where often, or it doesn't punish you as much, where often you are going to be on parity if you're playing with Kaisa, Survivor on the battlefield, and you can knock back something like Darius, especially if they're utilizing like a 2-card combo. And if they're utilizing the Vi combo, they already have ganking anyways, so it doesn't change anything for that. Okay, so my experience with Yasuo is really based from watching tournament play, but also having played him for roughly a month of Nexus Nights. And my vibe was that Yasuo's matchup for a very long time felt really bad into Kaisen, and I was really on the Nocturne version, which I feel like gets hyper punished by removal decks. So if you're playing the sort of more removal heavy version, or the more controlling version, I think the Kaisa and Annie matchups are a lot closer to parity than they appear, especially the Annie matchup, because you tend to play a lot of the same cards. And you're trading things like Sona and Mind Splitter for Red Darius and Vi, but your game plan remains a bit more flexible. The card that I did feel like completely hopeless into early on was Call the Weak. And Call the Weak often will punish you to an amazing degree because your green cards just like don't interact with it outside of Defy. If you're on a Victor matchup or like a Darius Hook matchup, do yourself a favor and side your third Defy as quickly as possible. And it's going to be pretty bad if the opponent either has a Recruit to sacrifice, or even more so like a Machine Herald, or anything like Vanguard Captain that they can bring back with Matron. So Call is really like a card that you hate seeing in this deck because you tend to play fewer units and you like protecting most of them. There are some exceptions, but especially if you're like on turn 6 and the only thing you have out is a Yasuo and they call you, it can feel pretty bad. Conversely, I found the Aurora matchup to be completely steamroll. You can very easily outmaneuver their spells. You can counteract removal very easily, and they will often let you push 2 units into battlefields and sit on them. But if you're on against like a Volibear, it doesn't really matter. The version I think that this deck has a more even matchup with for Aurora is MF, especially if they catch you out with a Sabotage early. But even then, I think this deck just plays at a pace that Aurora does not like having to face. So yeah, I'm very happy. And the other thing too is if you are on that Aurora matchup and they play something like Aspirant's Climb to make the game go longer, and you just pick up your Mind Splitter, you can often just make them discard it, and it'll feel pretty bad for them. So I'm a fan. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel about the matchups, but obviously you might feel a bit differently. So refinement, I think, is really the name of the game instead of like experimentate, like openness or like a dual archetype. I think people are still trying to figure out what Yasuo wants to do or what speed he wants to play at. For about the first month of the game, everybody was really on the Nocturne version. And my sense, having played it myself, is that Nocturne feels great when you hit him and awful when you draw him. Playing a 4 might unit with ganking that then gets countered by a Void Seeker feels pretty awful. So it's not great. I'll put it that way. And then there's like the medium slow version with Mind Splitter. There was like a very, very slow version that ran like multiple White Flames and Tasty Fey Folks. That's kind of phased out. I think people are kind of on the game plan that Yasuo wants to play slightly faster than the Aurora or super late game decks. And so really your top end is Mind Splitter and nothing else, and often you're not even going to get to that if you can like hold battlefields profitably. So most people have sort of fallen into one of these two camps. I myself favor the medium slow version, but I understand that the fast version is like super fun, and if you're not playing competitively, feel free to try it out. It is like a fun feeling version of the deck. So just grabbing some coffee. Okay, there's a discussion that I want to have about green and purple Yasuo. So purple Yasuo is one of the only sources of extra points, and that's super attractive. The dream is sort of like push Yasuo into a battlefield with your legend ability, gank him over to the other battlefield, and then pull him back with something like Fight or Flight, Flash, or a Ride the Wind, score a point. Why this is super interesting is because scoring a point off of a card does not follow the same restrictions as scoring your 8th point. So if you can do this on an open field that you've been trading down, you can win the game. And if you're on like 2 spells, you can even it's like 1, 2, 3. You could theoretically do it with 3 spells on an opponent turn. It's just really hard to do. It's a lot easier to do on your turn for sure. I think this combo is just like not good right now. 4 is like a horrifying breakpoint in general, and again, if you get punished by like a unit that cleaves into him, or a Void Seeker, or even something like Stupefy Hextech Ray, you're going to get punished really hard for trying to move him a lot, and you're effectively setting yourself up to be 2 for 1 or 3 for 1, depending on how you're doing this. So I'm not a fan, and I know a lot of people are like trying to brew with him in Spellsonger, the equipment that doubles the text box, so you can get 2 points when you move him. I just think that's more of the same, and I'm really not convinced that that's the way that that's going to be like a profitable strategy. Meanwhile, Green Yasuo is just good enough. So again, 6 is not the might that you'd want with him, but he has a good ability that you can utilize to great effect. For example, if he's on a battlefield, he's like on Windswept, and you move him around to another battlefield, he's effectively like a 12 might unit. And, well, I say effectively because he will trade down if, for example, if you're facing down like a 10 power unit and you hit it for 6, he's going to die as well. But he is like removal on a stick. And if you buff him, so if you give him like Discipline or On Guards, he just gets twice as big. So you do enjoy that. And that was kind of the logic between having something like White Flame, was like you play Yasuo, you protect it with some spells. Then on the next turn, you play White Flame, you get him up to 14. You just run him into a battlefield and kill a unit, only one. But I feel like relying too much on Yasuo is also not a profitable strategy. Unlike Vi, he doesn't trade well into wide boards. Vi just gets like very big and will just like kill a bunch of small units with might. Yasuo's ability only targets a single unit. So he's less good and he's more expensive. I love him. So I would still recommend like that version of Yasuo over the purple one. Okay, so the budget version of this deck, often I provide you like a budget version that I'm downgrading or like a starter deck. I'm just gonna give you GhaelWinds' deck, and his link is gonna be in the video below. This is the version that he made top 64 at Houston with. I think he ended up in 64th or 62nd place. I can't remember exactly. And this version of the deck looks like what I would expect a controlling version to look like. So you have 10 2-cost units between 3 Traveling Merchant, 3 Poro, 2 Clockwork Keeper, and 2 Tide Turners to move stuff around. You have 3 Wielder of Water, and then you just have like 3 Mind Splitter and 2 Raza. And Raza often will be like a 4 or 5 cost unit, maybe less. And then you have 1 Yasuo. So this deck tops out at 7. And then pretty much everything else is either interaction or card draw. And you have like the one of Zhonya's to protect, and you have the one of Master Foresight. This deck is on 2 scrap heap, so you will like play him. You'll start off with Zon. You'll trade the scrap heaps off of the Traveling Merchant or the Zon effect, and then on match 2, depending on what you're against, you're going to side in some other cards. Your presumably second battlefield is going to be Targon's Peak, which gives you like a sort of conditional Annie effect. And then Windswept Hillock is your ganking battlefield that we were talking about earlier. So this deck has exactly the problem that you would expect of something like this, which is it can't like put out, Mundo-sized might, but you can push stuff around. You can charm units into unwieldy battles. You can use your 2 of Fight or Flight or your 1 Repulse, Rebuke, and then you can side in more Rebukes, and you can have like your 1 of Ride the Wind. So I generally like this deck a lot. I think this is closer to how I would want to build the deck now, and it's more about refining and figuring out like unit counts based on your preferences. And then you kind of move into normally I would say these are like luxury decks, but really they're just experimental versions where you're trying to find what works for you. So my advice is really like play the GhaelWinds one. Start with people who've been optimizing for the current metagame and see why they're playing that way. And then assess whether you want the deck to play faster or slower or beyond the Nocturne game plan. That's really what you should be doing with this deck, is finding answers to your metagame, which is, undeniably going to be different at the local level from something like a national tournament, because people don't have access to all the cards right now. And so there are, some amount of Kaisas running around or some amount of Annies, but you're also going to see, like, I regularly see, like, Volibears and Victors and Sets, and even a Leona at my locals. So you can go around that. The version that I want to highlight, which I'm not a big fan of, but I think really is key for the version that we're talking about, is the Denny Early list from a skirmish recently, where I think he won. And you might notice that this version looks a bit different. So no Tide Turners and no Clockwork Keepers. It runs Mystic Poros, and it runs Candlelit Sanctum in the battlefields. These are all for Nocturne. And it has the 1 of Inverted Timelines, which will discard 4 and make you draw into your Razas or make them super cheap, along with 1 White Flame Protector. Basically, the cost of this deck, like what's making it expensive, are the 3 stack decks and the White Flame. And then the sideboard has the 1 of Kog'Maw, which I think is really for like go wide matchups. I'm not like a super big fan of it. And it runs a bit more Zhonya's and Find Your Centers. And again, I've played something like this deck that ran like 3 of Nocturne, and my sense is that when you don't draw Nocturne, it feels great, but it makes your mulligans really tricky, because if you don't see Nocturne in your hand, and then you mulligan and you draw him, you feel really punished. So I'm not like a big fan. Also, triple Mask of Foresight for me is kind of like a danger zone. It's one of those cards that when it's online and you feel good about it, it feels really good. But if somebody thermos this and you've lost like 3 cards because people are running like anti-Aurora or anti-Baited Hook tech, it just feels awful. I think Gear is like kind of a bait most of the time. I'm not a big fan. And it runs some side cards for Auroras, which I'm not seeing that many of. And the more successful lists that ran Aurora are now swapping to like mid-rangey, where you just play the units as well. So I want you to know what this looks like. It's not my favorite. And then I don't usually do this, but I'm going to show you the list that I'm currently tinkering around with. So this list is somewhat different, and you might notice by the title, this list is effectively asking the question, what if I could play an Annie deck, but inside of a Yasuo shell? So it has more movement tech. It runs one extra Ride the Wind. It runs double flash because I only have two, and I'm not going to spend $70 for a third one right now. And then it still runs sort of like the Gust on Guard Charm package. It's slightly lighter on 2 drops, missing out on the Tide Turners. And instead of the Razas, what I run, and I'm happy to like not have that top end, is Sona. And I think Sona is really like the key card of this deck, which I like putting on something like Dreaming Tree and protecting with like movement spells or your buff spells. And effectively, this deck tries to have as many self-targeting effects, as many like move around effects, and as many like key trades as the Annie deck does. So it's looking for similar ethos, although it can't really replicate the explosive power of the Vi combo. But you can disrupt it with your Mind Splitters. And I run one extra Yasuo currently because I didn't have the Mind Splitter, but I'm actually liking it a lot with the 2 of Ride the Wind, which allows some, some tricks here and there. This deck is what I would qualify more as a mid-range deck. It's not looking to win the game ultra fast, but it doesn't want to go super late either. And the sideboard, 1 extra Ride the Wind and 2 Rebukes. Rebukes are really for when you're facing a deck that has bigger units than you, and Ride the Wind is for when you're facing a deck that goes super fast, and you, for example, might not want both Mind Splitters. 1 extra Zonias if you need more protection. And then Windwall is an interesting card. I think Windwall is only good if you are suspicious of a deck that runs either Acathian Rain, so Kaistas, or Time Warps. That's really where it's going to shine. And otherwise, I'm not like the biggest fan. Decks don't run spells that are often like 6 or above. It does punish something like Singularity, but Singularity is also sometimes punished if you rebuke your own units or if you have Zonias. So I don't know. It's like weird. You can't retreat out of Singularity with this deck is really it. And then Last Breath, I like for either a version of this deck where I have to gank a little bit more, and I only bring Last Breath in games 2 and 3, either because I can use that Dreaming Tree. More often than not, I can use it with Windswept Hillock to produce like a pseudo ganking effect as well on the green Yasuo. This version is more expensive than the other 2 versions because of the flashes, but if you don't have flashes and you're not interested in running them, feel free to run like an extra Rebuke and maybe like or 2 Tide Turners, and you're going to be quite fine. I like Flash more than I like Tide Turners because I'm on Sona, but I'm still tinkering around with this, so we'll see what happens. And yeah, the price points, like we're talking about $30 for Gale's version, about $75 for Denny Early's version, and like $90 for my version. So honestly, my real advice is just play Gale's version and then see if you like it enough. And if you like Gale's version and you don't feel like investing into flashes, or you don't have them, or especially like White Flames, you can just wait to put your money into Spirit Forge singles that you like for whatever version you're going to be on. There's a lot of deflect units coming up. There's a lot of like cool spells. Irelia slots very well into Yasuo, or Yasuo slots very well into Irelia. It's kind of hard to tell yet, but there's certainly going to be, for my money, a green-purple deck that's going to be like competitive come next set. So really what you're looking at right now are like the sleeper colors, right? Everything is dirt cheap because nobody's playing this color combination, and Yasuo in general is like dirt cheap except for the overnumber. So, if you have like the money lying around and you want to play this and you're not like competing for a skirmish, feel free to do it. See how it feels to you and see if you can get margins with it. Uh, that's really the Yasuo like example. And if there are other Yasuo players in here who are using other versions, I am curious to hear from you as always. I think this is like just a generally underexplored concept, and I think Yasuo has this perception as like a bad champion. But you don't make it to day 2 of a tournament if the deck is unplayably bad. That's all I'm gonna say. All right. Next Monday, we're talking about the Spirit Forged Calm cards. So the plan going forward is going to be to do, like, as always, like an in focus episode. We have some time now. Like a lot of a lot of the skirmish events happen start of December, and Houston is done. So we're back to regular Nexus nights until January for most places. After like this Saturday, it's the holiday season as well. If you're in Europe, so a lot of people are going to be like off, visiting family. So I figure it's the time to just go through the Spirit Forge stuff and look at early gameplay from China, and then to sort of keep on going through all of the remaining legends for Origins and Proving Grounds as we get closer to February. So that's the plan. And thank you as always for tuning in. Thank you for all the support and the commentary. I have some stuff to fix on the Fury card video. I made some mistakes in how I read some cards as usual. So that might pop up in the comments. But otherwise, I will see you next Monday, and I hope you have a nice weekend. And if you're going to a skirmish this weekend, good luck.